Hello F1 fans! Welcome back to the F1 Masters podcast brought to you by AUBG Daily. As usual, you're with myself Harry, David and Vasco, and in this episode we're going to discuss the 2024 F1 Chinese Grand Prix.
And we start from the first practice and the only practice session for the weekend, and it had very strange results with Lance Stroll taking P1, Oscar Piastri taking P2, having Hülkenberg and Magnussen 5th and 6th, but I don't think that shows the real pace of the teams, and I'm not a big fan of having only one practice session for the whole weekend, but who am I? I'm not part of the executive committee in F1, so I cannot say anything. But we can move on to the very interesting sprint qualifying session that we had this weekend.
Sprint qualifying also had some unexpected results, it must be said, as it did start raining in Q3. And we had Lando Norris claim, I guess, pole position, but not really a pole position. Lewis Hamilton was on the front row as well, which was surprising to see him. Fernando Alonso, the top 3. We had the two Saubers rounding out the top 10. And overall, it was a quite interesting session, we must say. We have to mention George Russell got eliminated in Q2. And Yuki Tsunoda, who's been having a good season, only managed P19. It was a pretty hectic order.
Also, we have to mention Valtteri Bottas and Guan Yu Zhou, and especially Guan Yu Zhou because he was in front of a home crowd, and I think he really felt that passion from the fans and the support. And also Lewis Hamilton, who I think he was for like 5 or 6 seconds, he was P1 at the sprint quali, but after that they reinstalled the lap of Lando Norris, which allowed him to take P1 in the sprint qualifying, but that didn't help him in the sprint race actually.
And speaking of the sprint race, Lewis Hamilton had an amazing start, and Lando Norris, on the contrary, had a really bad start. He had to go off track because Lewis Hamilton claimed the first corner and then went on into the lead. But afterwards, Max Verstappen made a comeback and he claimed P1, of course. And also, we have to mention that Fernando Alonso had some technical issues and had to DNF. And overall, also Charles Leclerc P4, McLaren's in 6th and 7th. It was an alright sprint race, like nothing that special, nothing that interesting. That's why I think we can move on to the qualifying.
Yeah, the qualifying, things went in a way back to normal with the Red Bull 1-2, Verstappen Perez. Fernando Alonso had a great qualifying in P3 with a car that is definitely not where it should be. It should be much further down the order behind the McLarens and Ferraris, that's for sure. But he managed to outperform it and he did really well. But the biggest surprise in qualifying was Lewis Hamilton qualifying in P18 after an amazing start to the weekend, qualifying second for the sprint and finishing second in the sprint as well. It was looking like this was his comeback weekend or redemption weekend, but qualifying completely ruined hopes of a good result in the race.
But that was due to his mistake in the qualifying session, and I think we continue to see these disappointing performances when it matters most for Lewis Hamilton, and that is becoming a trend at Mercedes this year. So do you think that Mercedes are actually okay with not performing well enough this season, and they're just like, oh, scrape it and we're going for the next year? Because at least that's how it looks like right now at Mercedes.
Yes, I agree. I think that unfortunately this is the case for them, and they cannot do anything because they cannot switch Lewis Hamilton. I mean, even though he's not performing well, they cannot put another driver in his place. So they just have to deal with it by the end of the season and wait for 2025.
And while he was in the qualifying session, his teammate didn't have the best qualifying session again. 8 is not that bad for the standard set by Mercedes for this season, but I think still fans expect much more. They expect at least one of the cars to be in top 5 or top 6. Another great quali session for McLaren, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri. Great teammate dynamic, great development of the car so far, I think. And overall, McLaren are like a breath of fresh air this year, because we did see them at the beginning of the season having an alright car and right now continuing to change, to improve. So I'm really impressed with the way McLaren are dealing with this season, and I hope till the end of the season we can see again much better things from them. And Ferrari 6th and 7th, the only actually very interesting thing in this qualifying session for me was Fernando Alonso, because his lap in the qualifying session in Q3 was impressive.
I think we can move on to the race now, and our top three finishers were Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, and Sergio Perez, and we had 3 DNFs: Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda, and Valtteri Bottas. Well, let's start with the beginning of the race start. Fernando Alonso, incredible start, overtaking Perez, moving up into P2, challenging Verstappen for the lead. It felt kind of, I guess, vintage Alonso in a way, that start. It really brought me back to his Ferrari days. Just incredible start, and proving that he is still on top of this game even at 42 years old.
The first lap was very old school, very badass, if I can say it in that way, because it was very, very interesting. I want to see this kind of starts in the races, because we mentioned this, we talked about it last week, I think, in the podcast, that F1 pilots have become too cautious, and especially in risky moments like that, when you can get a lot of places, but yeah, it is high risk, high reward situation. And I think in the past few years, drivers decide to not fight in these situations, as they prefer to be cautious. And I saw something different on the opening lap this weekend. I saw something interesting, and I hope till the end of the season we can see these glimpses of something very exciting happening at the beginning of the races.
As you said, cautious. This is the word that describes Lewis Hamilton's start and the first few laps of the race, because he was not really gaining places. He was slow, and he started P18. I think that he managed to climb to like P14 a few laps, like at least 10 laps after the start. And I was quite disappointed, because I expected him to be much better, even though that car is not like one of the best currently. But nothing that much interesting happened in the first few laps. And I think we can move on to the part where Valtteri Bottas had an engine failure, and this resulted in a virtual safety car and then a real safety car, which caused a little bit of chaos in the race.
Yes, quite strange decision making from the FIA, just not being consistent, I guess, with their decision. VSC and then making a full safety car. If you were that concerned, why not just bring out the full safety car? Because this really cost people a lot in terms of strategy. We saw Lando Norris jump up to second thanks to this whole VSC portion, with Perez pitting under the safety car. Both Red Bulls pit under the safety car, but with the field bunching up and Lando making his stop under the VSC, it allowed for him to jump in between the two Red Bulls, and Perez even dropped to fourth as he came out behind Charles Leclerc. So I think that for future races, the FIA shouldn't really do this kind of thing in terms of virtual safety car for 2 laps and then a full safety car, because it's not fair to teams. Don't decide to pit under the VSC, because then a full safety car just completely changes everything.
We haven't really talked about it in the podcast, but the decision-making process of FIA hasn't been consistent, and it hasn't been consistent for a lot of years now. And I don't really know if there is a way to improve it, because right now it only causes controversy. So that is my question to you. Do you think there is a way by which the decision-making process in the FIA can be made much more consistent? So, of course, not all the teams, not all the drivers will always be happy, but at least they will know the framework, and that would make it a lot easier. Do you think there is a way that can happen?
Yes, I think there can be certain policies can be implemented. So, like, you have a certain situation, they have described it, and then when this happens, they know, for example, we have to deploy a virtual safety car. This is how it works.
Well, I think the main problem is that this decision-making process is for like 5, 10, 20, 30 seconds. You have less than a minute to decide what is going to happen, and that can decide the whole race. And I think that, especially that decision-making process, is not constructed well enough, and it works against FIA and against F1 overall.
I think the FIA are too pessimistic with their decisions because when they deploy the virtual safety car, it's usually like, okay, let's calm down the race and we'll think about if this is worth a full safety car or not. It's kind of like a pause button in a way I see it when they deploy a virtual safety car. I think they just need to be more assertive with their decisions. The virtual safety car has existed for not even 10 years, something like since 2016, I want to say 2015, 2016. It's still relatively new, and the FIA continue to use it more and more, but I think they use it just as a precautionary measure because, for what happened to Valtteri Bottas, let's say 15 years ago, that wouldn't even be considered for any sort of safety car. It would just be a yellow flag. The car would be brought back out of the track, and there would just be green flag racing without any other pauses. So I think the FIA they're over precautious, which I understand after the Jules Bianchi incident, but there are times where you don't really need to do that, and because it just mixes up the race and it can confuse a lot of teams.
They use it as an insurance in a way, but I think that is killing the dynamic, the tempo that has been established throughout the whole race, and they're not giving after that they're not giving anything really exciting to the fans, and I think that is a problem, but that is not one of the most serious problems of the FIA. So I think in the years to come it will be decided. They'll find an effective solution, in my opinion, but for now there are situations like that from time to time. But we can move on to the restart of the race.
The restart was very chaotic. At the penultimate corner, there was the cars bunched up a lot, and Fernando Alonso locked up, which resulted in a domino effect because the people behind him, namely Piastri, Ricciardo, and Stroll, basically crashed into each other. So Piastri was the first one, then Stroll just didn't use his brakes and bumped into Ricciardo, who basically flew into the air. And it was quite a bizarre incident. You don't see that very often. But I think that the one to blame is Lance Stroll because he didn't react on time.
It really reminded me of Mugello 2020, that incident. The cars just all slowing down and the cars at the back not really knowing what's happening. Even though I guess Lance Stroll is at fault because he just plows into the back of Daniel Ricciardo, I don't think he expected the cars to slow down as much as they did. Maybe that's also as a result of the cars at the front driving quite slowly, especially at a really sharp corner. And the cars at the back, they assumed that they're gonna start getting, going faster and faster, but they didn't. And yeah, Lance Stroll hits Daniel Ricciardo. I think it's just similar to Mugello. It's down to the fact that the cars in front are driving so slow, bunching up the cars behind who are trying to keep up and catch up with the cars, that they don't know how fast the cars are going to move in front, resulting in kind of a misunderstanding or miscommunication between the drivers. And I think it was just an unfortunate incident, unlucky for Daniel Ricciardo and for Lance Stroll. I wouldn't say that there's anyone to blame. Yeah, I think it's just one of those incidents where there's really nothing the drivers can do, and it just kind of happened.
And moving on to Magnussen, who spins Tsunoda, and he ended his race. Yuki Tsunoda was qualified as did not finish, and Kevin Magnussen was 16th, so underwhelming race for him. And we had really great battle between Lance Stroll and Kevin Magnussen, wheel-to-wheel battle at the last laps of the race, but they ended 15th and 16th, so I don't think it's quite amazing. So average race for Magnussen and Lance Stroll. I don't really know what is going to happen with him, with Aston Martin, but I think all the F1 fans are like, okay, he'll stay in the sport as long as his father is the owner of the team. So I don't think that is one of the hottest questions in F1 right now. And we have to mention Fernando Alonso, who had very great qualifying session and started really well. And again, not for the first time in this season, he had very bizarre strategy strategy. He had some really strange decisions, strange pit stops, and using softs and after that mediums for the last 10 laps of the race. I'm not sure what is happening with Aston Martin. I like the team actually. I like the combo of Alonso and Stroll, and I think they can achieve great things, but for now, very bizarre situation in the team, and I don't know what is going to happen in the future with them. And although Alonso made some late overtakes, he ended up 7th, which is again underwhelming for the aim that Aston Martin has.
After this analysis, we're moving on to the fun rubric and starting with the highlight of the weekend. For me, this was the already mentioned battle between Magnussen and Stroll. It was pure racing. It was wheel to wheel. They gave each other enough room, but they also were close. There wasn't any contact, and I just loved it.
I just want to mention that battle. It's crazy that it happened between Lance Stroll and Kevin Magnussen, the two most contact-prone drivers, I feel like, on the grid. So it was outstanding that they didn't have a crash. My highlight of the weekend, it's actually Max Verstappen, because even though Max Verstappen, we're used to him winning every race, Max Verstappen in the sprint qualifying, he qualified 4th, and that honestly had me a little concerned about him and the Red Bulls in terms of their performance. But in the sprint, he showed up and he had blistering pace and pulled over a 13-second gap in the span of 10 laps, which was unbelievable. And he got his 5th consecutive pole position to start the season. And even with the safety car actually hindering Red Bull's strategy, he still managed to maintain his lead and keep a distance to the cars behind. So overall, very impressive driving from Max Verstappen considering the circumstances.
Again, amazing weekend for him, and I was impressed again with his whole performance, but my highlight of the weekend is called Lando Norris because of all his performances throughout this weekend. First, the pole position in the sprint qualifying session in the rain, which was one of the probably the most interesting qualifying session that we have watched so far in the season. And after that, although he didn't manage to do his best in the sprint, I think during the race he redeemed himself, and with great strategy from McLaren, he managed to separate the two Red Bulls, Verstappen and Perez, and ended up 2nd, which is really impressive for McLaren for the state that they are at right now. And I think he deservedly won Driver of the Day.
I agree with that. And we move on to surprise and disappointment of the weekend. My surprise is the already mentioned Lando Norris. I won't add anything. And my disappointment is Lance Stroll, because this has been the story of his season. He's just underperformed. When Alonso is getting points constantly, Lance Stroll is just in the middle of nowhere.
My surprise was Nico Hülkenberg, mainly because he got 1 point, which is strange occurrence for Haas. And my disappointment was Lewis Hamilton qualifying session, because if you're Lewis Hamilton, it's simply impossible. It is forbidden for you to get out in Q1 and be 18th. So I think that was embarrassing for Lewis, and I want to see more of him throughout the season. And I want to see till the end of the season, I want to see this passion, this motivation that seems to be lost in him in the first few races.
My surprise of the weekend, similar to Harry, it is Lando Norris. I also wanted to add, if we think back to Bahrain, how McLaren and Mercedes were almost identical on pace, and now it just seems like McLaren are miles ahead. It's just unbelievable how that has happened in the span of 5 races. So it shows good development from McLaren and really a lack of development from Mercedes. My disappointment is actually Kick Sauber, because even though they've still yet to score points this season, actually considering the pace they were showing in the sprint qualifying, they both made it to Q3, and actually Zhou Guanyu finished 9th in the sprint, which is no points. Valtteri made it into Q3 for the main race as well. They were showing some good pace, and I actually thought that they could be on for a points paying position, but pretty much an awful race. Valtteri Bottas retiring with an engine failure, and Zhou only finishing a measly 14th. that his home race, I would definitely say that it was quite disappointing from their standards.
And moving on to our predictions, for this race, I said that Ricciardo will beat Tsunoda, which proved to be correct even though both DNF'd, and there would be at least 5 DNFs, which is incorrect. But my predictions for Miami are that Mercedes will be in the top 5, at least one of them, and Alpine will get points.
My predictions from last week were unsuccessful and I won't even want to mention them. But for this week, I predict at least one RB in Q3. I think they have the pace, they just need to be consistent. And my very bold prediction is that Stroll is going to be ahead of Fernando Alonso at the end of the race in Miami. I haven't stated how that is going to happen. Alonso can crash, he can have a problem with the car, but in the end of the race, I think Stroll will be ahead of Fernando Alonso.
My 2 predictions for China were that Lewis Hamilton would beat George Russell. He did in the sprint, but not in the race. I wouldn't count that since he didn't beat him in the race, but maybe it's worth half a point. And both Alpines in Q2, and both Alpines actually got into Q2, which is extremely random, but I'll take the point. And for my predictions for Miami, since it is another sprint weekend, unfortunately, I have actually predicted that we will have a different winner in the sprint race and in the main race. And my other prediction is that Oscar Piastri will finish ahead of Lando Norris. He's had quite an underwhelming start to the season, or I guess underwhelming last few races compared to Lando. I think he'll bounce back in Miami and finish ahead of Lando. But I think, guys, this is all for today from us. We're looking forward to the next episode. Till then, like, subscribe, and follow us in AUBG Daily on Instagram and Facebook, and stay tuned for more of our content. Thank you, and remember,
if you no longer go for a gap that exists,
You're no longer a racing driver.